Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class, we will learn Tosfos Dibra Maschil, V'im Yischilu Ein Mafsikin. Let's begin. V'im Yischilu Ein Mafsikin. And if one started, he doesn't have to stop. In the Mishnah, we learned that there are 5 activities a person is not permitted to do close to the time of Mincha. However, the din is that if a person did begin any one of these activities, we will not obligate him to stop, rather we'll permit him to continue, and then he will daven afterwards. Tosfos will explain a detail about this din, and then bring 3 proofs to it. So let's begin. Afilu hischilu be'isr, and this is in a purple arrow pointing upwards, because Tosfos is explaining a detail regarding this case, and that is, even if he started when it was asr, still we say that if one started, he doesn't have to stop. So we're not explaining that it's referring to a case where a person started when it was permitted and then extended into the time that it's prohibited. So we say we permit him to continue. Rather, even if the person began one of these activities when he wasn't permitted to, nevertheless, once he begins it, we will not obligate him to stop. So this is the point that Tosfos is making. It's an explanation to the case that it's referring even to when the person began when it was prohibited. And now Tosfos brings 3 proofs to this. Like it's proven in Masechta Sukkah, regarding one who comes from the road and he doesn't have a lulav in his hand. The din over there is he takes it by his table. That's what it says. And the Gemara asks, and he asks in the Gemara over there, are you saying that one must stop, that the person needs to stop his meal and do the mitzvah of netilas lulav? But we learned in a Mishnah, referring to our Mishnah, if one started, he doesn't have to stop. So we have a contradiction. In Masechta Sukkah it says regarding lulav, a person needs to stop the meal in order to do the mitzvah of lulav. And over here it says a person does not need to stop the meal in order to daven mincha. And it says Tosfos, and we don't answer that here it's when he started when it was mutter. In our case, is referring to when he started when it was mutter, and then it extended to the Isser time, and therefore we're lenient on the person. We permit him to continue. V'gabi lulav is chilu be'isser the mitzafers manihu, and by lulav he started when it was aser. For its time is from the morning. By lulav, it's referring to the case where the person began the meal when it's aser, because the time of lulav is from the morning. This person is eating the meal during the day. So Gemara could have answered that the case of lulav, the reason the person needs to stop is because he began the meal when he wasn't allowed to. And our Mishnah, when he doesn't have to stop, it's because he began the meal before the time that he wasn't allowed to. The Gemara does not answer that, indicating that also our Mishnah is referring to a case when the person began the meal after it was already prohibited, and nevertheless we don't obligate him to stop. And that's why we have a contradiction, that by lulav it says that we do obligate him to stop. And now Tosfos moves on to the second proof. And this also seems so in the Gemara, which is referring to our Gemara later on in the Amid. The Ka'amar Kavan Deshari Hemine Lematruchinanle, that said later on in the Gemara, since he untied his belt, we don't bother him. So what this is referring to is, later on the Gemara says that once a person loosened his belt, it's considered that he began his meal. And according to the opinion that Tfilas Ma'ariv is a reshus, it's voluntary. Once the person untied his belt and he began the meal, we won't obligate him to stop. So the Gemara asked, that seems to indicate that according to the opinion that Tfilas Arvis is a choiv, as an obligation, then we will obligate him to stop. And the Gemara asks, but we see in our Mishnah that speaks about mincha, which is also a choiv, it's obligatory, and nevertheless, we don't obligate the person to stop. So the Gemara asks this contradiction, why by Ma'ariv will we obligate the person to stop, and by mincha we won't? And the Gemara doesn't answer that by Ma'ariv it's referring to when the person began the meal when it was already aser, and therefore we're strict with him and we obligate him to stop. And by our Mishnah, by mincha, it's referring to when he began the meal when it was mutter, and therefore we're lenient with him and we don't obligate him to stop. That shows once again, because the understanding of our Mishnah is that it's also referring to a case when the person began the meal after it was already aser, and that's why we have a contradiction, that by Ma'ariv we will obligate him to stop when he started when it was aser, and by mincha we will not obligate him to stop even when he started after it was aser. And the third and final proof is also from our Gemara, and it also answers this that the Gemara asks, this that the Gemara has a difficulty, regarding, let us say this is a question on Rabbi Shua ben Levi. The Gemara said that our Mishnah seems to be a question on the teaching of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, because Rabbi Shua ben Levi said that even if a person began his meal, we will obligate him to stop. And our Mishnah says we do not obligate him to stop. Now what's the question? Rabbi Shua ben Levi could be referring to when the person began after it was already aser, therefore we're stricter with him and we obligate him to stop. And our Mishnah is referring to when he began the meal while it was still mutter, and therefore we're more lenient with him and we don't obligate him to stop. Clearly from this that the Gemara sees it as a question, it's because the Gemara understands that when our Mishnah says that we don't obligate him to stop, it's also referring to when the person began the meal after it was already usr, and after the time that it was already prohibited to begin the meal. And that's why we have a question between our Mishnah and Rabbi Shua ben Levi, that in both cases the person started the meal after it was already usr, and Rabbi Shua ben Levi says that we do obligate him to stop, and the Mishnah says we do not obligate him to stop. So to summarize, we basically had over here an explanation to the case that said that once a person began any of these 5 activities, we don't obligate him to stop. Says Tosfos. This is referring to even when the person began one of these activities after the time that he wasn't permitted to. And Tosfos brought 3 proofs to this, that it's referring even to such a case.